The numbers just released by the Australian Bureau of Statistics are nothing short of explosive, and they completely shatter every prediction, every government promise, and every assurance we've been given about controlled migration. Australia has just recorded the highest immigration intake in the nation's entire history, with 468,390 permanent and long-term arrivals in 2025, and this figure doesn't even include the hundreds of thousands on temporary visas, tourists who overstay, or the massive student cohort that's been flooding into the country. This is not a gradual increase. This is not a planned expansion. This is a migration surge of unprecedented scale, happening at exactly the moment when Australians are struggling with a housing crisis, infrastructure buckling under pressure, and government services stretched to breaking point. What you're about to discover will shock you, it will anger you, and it will fundamentally change how you understand what's really happening to this country right now. Welcome to Aussie Global Affairs, where we deliver unfiltered analysis of the policies, statistics, and political decisions shaping Australia's future. I don't sugarcoat the data, I don't parrot government talking points, and I don't shy away from controversial truths that mainstream media often ignores. Today we're breaking down the bombshell immigration statistics for 2025, and I'm going to show you not just the numbers, but what's behind them, who's benefiting, who's suffering, and what this means for Australia's immediate and long-term future. By the end of this video, you'll understand why these record numbers happened despite all the rhetoric about reducing immigration, and more importantly, what impact this is having on housing, jobs, wages, and the quality of life for everyone already living in Australia. Let's start with the raw numbers because they are staggering in their scale. 468,390 permanent and long-term arrivals in a single calendar year represents an increase of 34% compared to 2024, which itself was already a record year. To put this in perspective, this is more than double the immigration intake from a decade ago, and it's nearly 4 times the levels from the early 2000s. We're talking about a rate of population increase through migration that is equivalent to adding a city the size of Canberra to Australia's population every single year. The scale is breathtaking, and it's happening faster than any infrastructure planning or service provision can possibly keep pace with. Breaking down these numbers by visa category reveals some fascinating and disturbing patterns. The skilled migration stream accounts for approximately 185,000 of these arrivals, which is actually slightly down from government targets, suggesting that even with record total numbers, Australia is struggling to attract the highly skilled professionals the system is supposedly designed for. The family reunion stream brought in 78,000 people, significantly up from previous years as backlogs created during pandemic border closures are finally being processed. The humanitarian program contributed 18,400 arrivals, roughly in line with the annual quota. But here's where it gets interesting and controversial. Approximately 186,990 of these arrivals are what the statistics classify as long-term temporary residents transitioning to permanent status or returning former residents who maintained ties to Australia. This last category is crucial to understanding what's really happening. These are people who were already in Australia on temporary visas, primarily former international students and temporary skilled workers who have now achieved permanent residence. On paper, this shouldn't add to the population because these people were already here. But in practice, it does, because temporary visa holders behave differently than permanent residents. They're more mobile, more likely to leave and return, less likely to bring family members. Once they achieve permanent residence, their behavior changes. They settle more permanently, they bring partners and children, they buy property, they put down roots. So counting these as not adding to net migration is statistically questionable and practically misleading. The student visa sector is where some of the most dramatic growth is occurring, though these numbers don't fully appear in the permanent arrival statistics. Australia granted approximately 670,000 new student visas in 2025, a number so enormous it's difficult to comprehend. Not all of these students are in Australia simultaneously due to course durations and departures. but the best estimates suggest there are currently around 850,000 international students physically present in the country at any given time. These students are overwhelmingly concentrated in Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane, and they're not just studying, they're working, they're renting housing, they're using infrastructure, and they're competing for all the same resources as permanent residents and citizens. The impact on housing cannot be overstated, and this is where the immigration surge intersects most painfully with ordinary Australians' daily lives. Australia has a severe housing shortage. Vacancy rates in major cities are at historic lows, below 1% in Sydney and Melbourne. Rental prices have increased by an average of 38% over the past 3 years. Home prices have surged by 45% in the same period, putting ownership further out of reach for first-time buyers. And into this crisis, we're adding close to 500,000 people annually who all need somewhere to live. The mathematics simply doesn't work. Australia builds approximately 170,000 to 180,000 new dwellings per year in a good year. Even accounting for people leaving the country and normal housing turnover, we're adding population far faster than we're adding housing stock. The result is exactly what you'd expect from basic supply and demand economics. Rents are becoming unaffordable for working families. Young Australians are living with parents well into their 30s because they can't afford to move out. Homeless services are overwhelmed with record numbers of people seeking assistance, and increasingly these aren't the traditional homeless demographic. They're working people who simply cannot afford housing in the cities where their jobs are located. The government acknowledges the housing crisis, but refuses to acknowledge the obvious connection between adding 468,390 people in a single year and the worsening shortage. Instead, they blame planning regulations, construction bottlenecks, and investor behavior as if adding hundreds of thousands of people who need housing somehow isn't relevant to housing demand. Infrastructure strain is the second major impact that's becoming impossible to ignore. Public transport in Sydney and Melbourne is overcrowded beyond capacity during peak hours. Emergency rooms have wait times that have blown out to dangerous levels. Schools in growth areas are running classes from portable buildings because permanent facilities can't be built fast enough. Roads are gridlocked. Water and energy infrastructure is under stress. These aren't temporary problems that will resolve themselves. These are the predictable consequences of adding population faster than infrastructure can expand. Infrastructure planning in Australia typically operates on 10 to 20-year horizons. Major projects like new rail lines, hospitals, or water systems take years to design and build. When population growth through migration exceeds projections by this degree, the infrastructure deficit grows every single year. The government argues that immigration is necessary to fill skill shortages and support economic growth. And there is some truth to this argument, but it's a truth that needs serious scrutiny. Yes, certain sectors face genuine skill shortages. Healthcare is desperately short of nurses and doctors. Aged care facilities cannot find enough workers. Some trades are in short supply. But the immigration system isn't primarily filling these gaps. Analysis of the actual occupations of skilled migrants shows that the largest categories are accountants, software developers, and business analysts, professions where Australia has significant numbers of graduates and existing workers. Meanwhile, the sectors with the most acute shortages, particularly aged care and disability support, rely heavily on temporary visa holders rather than permanent skilled migrants. This creates a two-tier labor market that benefits employers at the expense of workers. Temporary visa holders are more vulnerable, less likely to complain about conditions, more willing to accept lower wages because their visa status depends on employment. This isn't speculation. Multiple academic studies and government inquiries have documented widespread underpayment and exploitation of temporary visa holders, particularly international students working in hospitality, retail, and agriculture. When you have 850,000 international students who are allowed to work up to 48 hours per fortnight, and hundreds of thousands more temporary workers on various other visa categories, You create a large pool of vulnerable labor that undercuts wages and conditions for everyone else. The wage impact is measurable and significant. Real wages in Australia have barely grown over the past decade when adjusted for inflation. In sectors with high concentrations of temporary migrant workers, wages have actually declined in real terms. Young Australians entering the job market face competition from a massive cohort of international students willing to work for less. Entry-level positions that used to be stepping stones to career development are now often filled by temporary visa holders, creating a generation of Australians who struggle to get their first job or their first experience in their field. The government insists that immigration doesn't affect wages, but this defies both economic theory and the lived experience of millions of workers. The composition of migration is also changing in ways that have significant social and economic implications. Australia's migration program was traditionally heavily weighted towards skilled independent migrants, people who applied based on their qualifications and were selected because they had skills Australia needed. This category is declining as a proportion of the total. Family reunion and humanitarian migration are increasing, and while these categories serve important purposes, they generally include a higher proportion of people who are not immediately economically productive. This means that while total migration numbers are at record highs, the economic contribution per migrant may actually be declining. More arrivals overall, but a smaller percentage who are highly skilled and immediately employable in critical sectors. The regional distribution of these arrivals is extremely uneven, which exacerbates the pressure on infrastructure and housing. Despite government programs attempting to encourage regional settlement, approximately 85% of new arrivals settle in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, or Perth. Within these cities, they concentrate in specific suburbs and corridors, often areas that are already experiencing rapid population growth and infrastructure strain. The result is that some communities are experiencing population growth rates of 5, 7, or even 10% annually, completely overwhelming local schools, transport, and services, while other parts of Australia are actually losing population or growing only very slowly. The political implications of these record immigration numbers are profound and potentially explosive. Both major political parties have promised to reduce immigration, to manage numbers responsibly, to ensure infrastructure keeps pace with population growth. These promises ring hollow when confronted with the reality of 468,390 arrivals in a single year. Polling consistently shows that a majority of Australians, including many migrants themselves, believe immigration levels are too high and should be reduced, yet policy moves in the opposite direction. This disconnect between public opinion and government policy is fueling cynicism, eroding trust in institutions, and creating political space for parties and movements that take harder lines on immigration. The business lobby is the primary force pushing for high immigration, and their influence on policy is overwhelming. Major employer groups, the property development sector, the retail industry, universities dependent on international student fees. These powerful interests benefit enormously from high immigration, and they lobby intensely to maintain it. High immigration means more customers, more renters, more workers, more students, more economic activity, regardless of the social costs. The business case for immigration focuses narrowly on GDP growth and overlooks the fact that GDP per capita, the measure that actually affects living standards, has been essentially flat or declining. Australia's economy is growing because the population is growing, but individual Australians are not becoming more prosperous. The international student industry deserves particular scrutiny because it has become a major driver of immigration numbers while providing questionable educational value in many cases. Australia's international education sector is worth approximately $40 billion annually, making it one of the country's largest exports. Universities have become dependent on international student fees to balance their budgets, with some institutions receiving over 30% of their revenue from international students. This creates perverse incentives where academic standards are lowered to keep students enrolled, where dubious private colleges exploit loopholes in the system, and where the primary purpose of much international education is not education at all, but rather securing a pathway to permanent residence. Investigation after investigation has revealed shocking practices in parts of this sector. Private colleges that exist primarily on paper, providing minimal actual education while collecting fees and maintaining students' visa status. Courses that are barely taught, with students required to attend only a few hours per week or even less. Qualifications that have little or no value in the Australian labor market but tick the boxes for visa requirements. This is not to say that all international education in Australia is problematic, far from it. Australia has world-class universities providing genuine education to talented students. But the explosive growth in student numbers has come largely from the lower quality end of the market, where the education is secondary to the immigration pathway. The strain on social cohesion is another consequence of rapid, high-volume immigration that receives insufficient attention. Australia has historically been successful at integrating migrants and building a genuinely multicultural society. But that success was built on a foundation of relatively gradual immigration with time and resources for integration, settlement services, English language programs, and community building. When immigration occurs at the current scale and pace, these integration mechanisms are overwhelmed. Ethnic enclaves form where people can live entirely within their original language and culture without needing to engage with broader Australian society. This isn't the fault of migrants who naturally gravitate toward communities where they have linguistic and cultural connections. It's a predictable outcome of volume and pace that exceed integration capacity. The generational divide on immigration attitudes is stark and worsening. Younger Australians, particularly those under 35, are significantly more negative about immigration than older cohorts, reversing historical patterns. The reason is obvious. Young people bear the brunt of the negative impacts. They're competing for entry-level jobs with temporary visa holders. They're competing for rental housing with international students often living 6 or 8 to a house to afford the rent. They're looking at homeownership as an impossible dream because property prices have been driven to absurd levels, partly by demand from migration. Meanwhile, older Australians who already own property and are established in careers experience the benefits of immigration. More diverse restaurants, appreciated property values, without the same acute pressures. The environmental impact of adding 468,390 people to Australia in a single year is substantial, though rarely discussed in immigration debates. Australia is one of the driest continents on Earth, with limited water resources and fragile ecosystems. The major cities where immigrants concentrate are already pushing the limits of sustainable water supply, particularly in an era of climate change affecting rainfall patterns. Energy demand increases with population, and while Australia is transitioning to renewable energy, the transition is slower than population growth, meaning more fossil fuels are being burned to power more people. Urban sprawl consumes agricultural land and natural habitats. Greenhouse gas emissions rise with population regardless of per capita efficiency improvements. These environmental considerations aren't arguments against immigration per se, but they are arguments for considering environmental carrying capacity in migration planning, something that essentially never happens in Australian policy debates. The question of how many people Australia can sustainably support in terms of water, energy, food production, and ecosystem preservation is treated as virtually taboo, as if asking it is somehow xenophobic. But it's a legitimate question that has nothing to do with where migrants come from and everything to do with the physical limits of the continent and the impact of human activity on Australian environments. The comparison with other developed countries is illuminating. Australia's immigration rate as a percentage of population is now the highest in the developed world. Canada, often cited as having high immigration, has a rate significantly lower than Australia's when properly calculated. The United States takes larger absolute numbers, but has a population 14 times larger than Australia's, making the per capita rate much lower. European countries have been reducing immigration in response to public pressure and social integration challenges. Australia stands alone among developed nations in maintaining and even increasing immigration to these extraordinary levels, despite facing similar pressures around housing, infrastructure, and social cohesion. So why is this happening? Why are immigration numbers hitting record highs when the government claims to be managing numbers responsibly? The answer lies in the complex interplay of political economy, institutional interests, and policy inertia. Universities need international student fees to survive in their current form. Business wants access to labor that holds down wages. The property development sector profits from population-driven demand. Treasury modeling assumes economic growth depends on population growth, creating policy pressure for high immigration. And politicians fear being labeled anti-immigrant or xenophobic if they advocate for significant reductions, even though most Australians across the political spectrum support lower numbers. There's also a disconnect between policy settings and outcomes. The government can announce tighter criteria for certain visa categories, but if those restrictions are offset by increases elsewhere or by more efficient processing reducing backlogs, the total numbers can still rise. The complexity of the migration program, with literally dozens of different visa categories, streams, and pathways, means that headline policy announcements don't necessarily translate to reduced numbers. The system has its own momentum, driven by hundreds of thousands of applications in progress, existing temporary visa holders seeking pathways to permanence, and the massive infrastructure of migration agents, lawyers, and education providers who have built business models around high immigration. What does all this mean for the future? If 2025's numbers of 468,390 represent a new baseline rather than an anomaly, Australia will add approximately 2.3 million people through immigration over the next 5 years. That's equivalent to adding a city larger than Perth to the population. The infrastructure required to accommodate this, the housing, the schools, the hospitals, the transport, represents investment in the hundreds of billions of dollars, investment that is not currently planned or budgeted. The alternative is continued deterioration in living standards as more people compete for inadequate housing, overwhelmed services, and strained infrastructure. There's a fundamental dishonesty in current policy discourse where politicians promise to address the housing crisis, improve infrastructure, and maintain quality of life while simultaneously running the highest immigration program in Australian history. These goals are incompatible at current immigration levels. You cannot solve a housing shortage while adding 500,000 people per year. You cannot reduce pressure on infrastructure while population grows faster than infrastructure expansion. The mathematical reality is inescapable, yet the policy conversation continues as if immigration and these other challenges are unrelated issues. For individuals navigating this situation, the implications depend on your circumstances. If you're a recent migrant or planning to migrate, understand that you're entering a much more competitive and expensive environment than existed even 5 years ago. If you're a young Australian trying to establish yourself, recognize that you're facing headwinds that previous generations didn't experience, and these are partly but not entirely due to immigration volume. If you're an established homeowner, your property has likely appreciated significantly, but consider what kind of society your children will inherit if current trends continue. If you're an investor or business owner, high immigration has likely benefited you through demand growth, but also consider whether a society under this much pressure is stable and sustainable. The path forward requires honest conversation about trade-offs and limits. Immigration has benefits, bringing skills, diversity, and demographic vitality to Australia. But benefits and costs both scale with volume, and there is no magic number that is objectively correct for all circumstances. What's clear is that 468,390 arrivals in a single year in a country of 27 million people in the midst of a housing crisis and infrastructure deficit represents a volume that is imposing enormous costs on the existing population, particularly on younger and lower-income Australians who have the least political power to resist these trends. Here at Aussie Global Affairs, we'll continue providing you with data-driven analysis of immigration trends, policy impacts, and the real-world consequences of these extraordinary numbers. We don't shy away from difficult conversations, we don't pretend that obvious tensions don't exist, and we don't accept government spin as fact without scrutiny. The 468,390 arrivals in 2025 is the highest immigration intake in Australian history, and this statistic will have ramifications for decades to come in housing markets, job markets, infrastructure planning, and social cohesion. Subscribe to Aussie Global Affairs right now and turn on notifications so you're immediately updated as new immigration data is released and as we continue analyzing the impacts of these record numbers. Hit that like button if you believe Australians deserve honest conversation about immigration rather than political rhetoric that ignores obvious realities. Share this video with everyone who needs to understand what's really happening with Australia's population growth and why housing, infrastructure, and services are under unprecedented pressure. Leave a comment with your perspective, whether you're a recent migrant, a long-term resident, or someone watching Australia from abroad. These are the conversations Australians need to have, based on facts and data rather than emotion and ideology. The breaking news is 468,390 arrivals, the highest ever, and the consequences of this unprecedented surge will shape Australia's future for generations. What you're about to discover will shock you, it will anger you, and it will fundamentally change how you understand what's really happening to this country right now. Welcome to Aussie Global Affairs, where we deliver unfiltered analysis of the policies, statistics, and political decisions shaping Australia's future. I don't sugarcoat the data, I don't parrot government talking points, and I don't shy away from controversial truths that mainstream media often ignores. Today we're breaking down the bombshell immigration statistics for 2025, and I'm going to show you not just the numbers, but what's behind them, who's benefiting, who's suffering, and what this means for Australia's immediate and long-term future. By the end of this video, you'll understand why these record numbers happened despite all the rhetoric about reducing immigration, and more importantly, what impact this is having on housing, jobs, wages, and the quality of life for everyone already living in Australia.